Good morning. I'm Terry Kimball, President and CEO at the Chandler Chamber, and we are so excited. We have a jam-packed morning for you. We have an update from the U.S. Chamber. It's a policy briefing on what is happening for your business and what's happening in Washington. And we have three dynamic speakers for you. This is part of our public policy series, and we know that Chandler is really, public policy is a huge component in our community, whether it's at the local level, at the state level, or at the federal level. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Elin Cruz. Elin is with SRP, and she is our public policy chair. And so thank you so much for joining us, Elin. And I also want to thank SRP for their continued support in your outreach in advocacy in policy, because that's really important here in Arizona. So I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Terry. Good morning, everybody. And it is a pleasure to be on the board, and it is an honor. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Ron Eishaug. As Vice President of the U.S. Chamber's Congressional and Public Affairs Division, Ron Eishaug helps oversee a team of 15 full-time Capitol Hill lobbyists. Eishaug is a sought-after speaker, providing an insider's perspective of Congress. He appears at engagements with governors, senators, members of Congress, administration officials, and business leaders across the United States, and he speaks to a wide range of international audiences. Eishaug has a unique ability to translate Washington speak into language that business leaders can understand. Eishaug is also the Chamber's chief lobbyist on environmental, energy, and regulatory reform issues. He joined the Chamber in 1999 and has served in a variety of roles. A native New Yorker, Eishaug worked in the New York State Governor's Office regulatory reform from 1995 to 1999 during the George Pataki administration. Eishaug has both a master's and a bachelor's degree in political science from the State University of New York at Albany. He resides in Vienna, Virginia with his wife, Pam, and their son, Evan. Welcome, Ron, and thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. It's good to see you all. So we're in the dog days of summer. We're at the end of August, and usually at this time, we'd be talking about how Congress had finished up their work and moved on to other things. But that is not the case right now. I think that we know that Congress largely left town before they completed work on the Phase 4 bill. Certainly this year is a lot different than normal years with COVID and the pandemic and the response. But things still are in a holding pattern. I'm going to talk about the issues that remain outstanding, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where we go from here, but I'm going to paint a little bit of a background first. So, you know, the House, so there's been 4 or 5 packages to deal with COVID at this point, depending upon how you count. The last solid step forward was the House passed their bill at the end of May. That was the Phase 4 bill. Largely, we thought that that would be a marker of the House priorities, but there are a lot of provisions in there that we didn't think would go any further. We thought the Senate would come back, they would pass their bill, negotiations would start, and we'd be off to the races. Time has gone on, and that has not been the case. By the end of July, the House and Senate have largely gone home. They're available to be called back at a moment's notice. We know that the White House Chief of Staff was actually trolling the Hill on Saturday when the House was back in session for a vote on postal reform. But not a lot of progress on this Phase 4 bill. In addition to Phase 4, Congress is going to need to deal with appropriations issues and keeping the government funded before the election, and then perhaps other issues like the Defense Authorization Bill, which is something that's been passed every year since the Eisenhower administration, turns into a Christmas tree for a lot of other issues. But by and large, the COVID response is probably the biggest piece of legislation that Congress will deal with, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. There's probably 6 or 7 different issues, again, depending upon how you count. And I'm gonna run through them quickly, and then I'll talk about them in more detail. So we continue to have the C6 issues. Chambers of commerce like the Chandler Chamber are not eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. We know that chambers of commerce, especially at the local level, are integral to their community. Lots of other nonprofits are eligible for the PPP, but chambers of commerce are not. We would like to see that fixed. Certainly the Paycheck Protection Program is something that needs to be updated. How and exactly what those changes are going to be remains another bucket of issues. Liability issues. You know, we often talk about frivolous lawsuits and those kinds of things, but protecting businesses, whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a manufacturer, whether you're a distiller that changed from distilling booze into making hand sanitizer, whether you're a healthcare professional, liability protection is something that's very important there. UI is also one of the issues that are out there. Right now, some, because of the extra $600 on UI that expired at the end of last month, many people were making $600, $400, $200 more a week than they were previously. That remains a very big issue. And then dealing with childcare and schools remains an issue. State and local funding and assistance is a big one, and the overall size of the package. So there's 6 or 7 issues that are out there. Those are what the issues are. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of them, and then we'll head into sort of what the path forward is. State and local assistance, more money to state and local governments to deal with the effects of the pandemic. That is a near certainty. There's certainly big areas of agreement that this is a need, and certainly there's a deal to be had there. Sort of as a sub bullet under that is dealing with unemployment trust funds, and Glenn will probably talk a little bit more about that in his presentation, where some states are going to have automatic tax increases if their UI trust funds run out. K through 12 and childcare remains a really big issue, making sure that childcare centers in particular, very low margin businesses, you know, you don't get into childcare to make a gajillion dollars, but dealing with the extra costs of PPP and cleaning and supplies and face masks and all of those things is a really big cost, and making sure that there's some extra funding available for those types of businesses to make sure that our kids are safe. Making sure that our kids are safe is really important to reopening the economy. So that's a big deal. I sort of talked about C6s. We've seen a lot of movement on this issue. The House bill has a really good fix for the C6 issue. There are some big challenges to the C6 issue on the Senate side. There are provisions in their bill that Senator McConnell put together, but we need to see some fixes in that bill. Right now, there's a cap in there that we would like to see adjusted. The fix for C6s is hanging by a thread on the Senate side, which is sort of remarkable, because if you talk to senators on the left and on the right, they all think that particularly local chambers of commerce should be included. But then there's also reports that this is really hanging in by a thread. The Paycheck Protection Program, dealing with issues like sort of a check the box loan forgiveness for smaller loans, something under $150,000 is really important. Expanding the programs, expanding the duration, dealing with some of the other issues. We think that there is an opportunity to work through those issues and have some relief. We think that that's good news, but we're going to continue to work on that and pay attention. And then we run into probably the big 3 issues, which are the biggest. The liability issue is certainly one of them. Like I said earlier, it's really important to make sure that businesses that are doing the right thing have temporary, timely, targeted liability relief. We don't want small businesses being sued because if someone comes down with COVID, they must have gotten sick at work, or they must have gotten sick at the restaurant that they went to, or they must have gotten sick somewhere else. Businesses that are doing the right thing, following what the government is telling them to do, should have that temporary, targeted, timely liability relief. We know that this is a big priority for Senator McConnell and the Senate. We know that this is an uphill slog on the House side. On the Senate side, Mitch McConnell has talked about that this legislation and liability relief is one of the red lines for him, that they won't do a bill without liability relief. Unfortunately, the White House sort of undercut that a little bit by saying, hey, that's McConnell's priority, that isn't ours. They've tried to walk that back, but liability reform is tenuous. Moving on to unemployment, certainly there's a big challenge between the $600. There's an argument that the extra $600 on the UI side is one of the reasons that the economy really didn't go into the tank in the early days of the pandemic. We also know that extra $600 really puts businesses in a tough spot. Small businesses are only eligible for that employees are only eligible for that $600 if they don't have a job. So if a small business calls someone back to work, you either have an unhappy employee because your employer is taking that extra $600 out of your pocket, putting the small businesses as the UI cop is not great here. You don't want angry employees. The U.S. Chamber has put some ideas on the table, and Glenn can probably talk to this with greater specificity, where there's some sort of dynamic scale or something. We think that there is a compromise to be had here, but we haven't seen a lot of movement. And then really we have the biggest issue, and the biggest issue on why there hasn't been movement here, and that's costs. The House is sort of at another $3 or $3.5 trillion. That's their number. The Congress already has done about $3.5 trillion in terms of the first 4 phases. The House has a very, very big number. The Senate, particularly among some of the conservatives on the Senate side, and even in the House, they're having trouble with a skinny bill at $500 billion or a trial balloon that McConnell floated of $1 trillion. There's good arguments on both sides on this, but there hasn't been a lot of movement. You also see that some of the economic signs where the stock market continues to do well, the unemployment numbers have not been as catastrophically bad as they were early in the year, have taken some effort to some momentum or some drive to resolve these issues, has sort of taken the foot off the gas to resolve these things. Congress is usually best at dealing with legislation when there's deadlines. And if we would have had this conversation a couple of weeks ago when we originally scheduled to meet together, we would have talked about the end of the UI, $600. We would have talked about the end of the PPP as some of the critical deadlines that they were out there. We've blown through both of them. We would have talked about the deadline of the beginning of the traditional August recess. And here Congress has largely gone out of town. So where do we go from here? The House and the Senate are not likely to come back into session until the second week in September after the Labor Day weekend. I think that we would expect to see some resolution there. But up to this point, I think that we would have thought that we would have had some resolution to this point. So I don't know. We need to continue to stay together in this. I think that Elin was right when she was talking about how important the advocacy is. I know that that we're glad to partner with you. Before the call started, we were talking about Jennings and Vartan, who I know that you deal with during times when people can actually travel. and see them all the time. We're going to continue to try and work through these issues. Really want your help. Really want your cooperation and teamwork in all of this. And we want to continue to be able to support all the things that you're doing. So maybe with that, Elin, I can turn it back to you, and we can get to some questions from me, and then turn it over to everybody else.
Thank you, Ron. So are there, how do we handle the questions? Are they on the chat, Terry?
I actually have had a couple that have been texted to me, so they haven't put them on the chat, so they're listening. So one of the questions that we have on the unemployment, because we do have employers that want to rehire, but the additional burden of documentation that is being brought onto businesses right now to be able to log that, and maybe this is a better question for Glenn, that's an issue right now, as well as the responding back from unemployment. And I know that that's a state agency and that, but it's a bigger conversation nationwide too.
I think we should probably put a pin in those and have Glenn address them, because he is much more qualified than I am to talk about the specifics of all of those things. I know that there are issues that we're following. We're really concerned. You know, at the U.S. Chamber level, we usually deal with just the federal issues. We know that state level issues surrounding UI and some of the others are creeping up, and we're trying to do the best that we can to share information, help address those issues. But let's put a pin in those for Glenn to get into a little bit more deeply.
Great. And then another question that we have is on the liability relief component. I know that we're actually fighting for that for businesses, but now as we see schools opening up and that, our schools, how are we going to incorporate schools and education that the liability is broad range?
Certainly, I think that that's a really, really important provision. I mean, you know, we're gonna highlight the business side of that. The school side is something also. I think what helps us is that, you know, this isn't, you know, look, the liability issue, the trial lawyer fight, the business fight is sort of one of those chronic issues where the two sides are the lines are very heavily drawn. And what I think that we need to do to be successful is show how these issues in this timely, temporary, targeted, this unique set of circumstances is something different that we need to deal with. We've had good response even among some of the House Democrats that we need to fix this issue. Even the House Democrats that want to fix this issue, though, are getting a lot of pushback from their leadership. Some of the Senate Democrats want to solve this issue too. We know that Senator Sinema has talked about resolving this issue. We really applaud her for talking about these kinds of things. But this is an issue. It hits businesses, particularly on the small business side. It hits schools. It hits those child care centers. It hits healthcare workers. It hits healthcare operators. All of those issues are tied together. We're going to do our best to sort of highlight the business impacts, but we're also going to be sort of working together with those other groups as well, because I think that we're more powerful talking about the liability side of these issues collectively as a COVID issue and not part of this larger trial lawyer business, big business fight that it's so easy for others to try and drag us into. So that's a very, very good point.
One other question, and I'm going to turn it back over to Elin, and this may be for Glenn, I'm not sure, but is there any relief for small business owners who are not getting paid at work, but they're eligible for unemployment but they are not eligible for unemployment because they are working?
I'm going to leave that also for Glenn.
I figured that.
Yeah, so, yeah, totally. I'm just a lobbyist. Glenn's a lot smarter than me.
Well, Ron, thank you so much. We love the input and the update, and I'm going to turn it back over to Elin, and she's going to get Glenn, because Glenn, your little to-do list is getting longer.
Allow me to introduce Glenn Spencer. Glenn Spencer is the Senior Vice President of the Employment Policy Division, which represents the interests of the employer community across a range of labor and employment issues. The division works to ensure the laws and regulations affecting employers are developed within employer concerns, acknowledged, and are fairly applied. It also provides businesses with guidance and expertise on legislative and regulatory matters. Before joining the chamber in July 2007, Spencer spent nearly 6 years at the U.S. Department of Labor in the Office of the Secretary, serving as a Deputy Chief of Staff and then Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Labor, Elaine L. Chao. Earlier in his career, Spencer was engaged in issue advocacy and grassroots lobbying for citizens for a sound economy in Washington, D.C., and also worked as a senior analyst in the research department of the National Republican Senatorial Committee and the Republican National Committee. Spencer's articles have been published in numerous leading newspapers, and he has appeared on nationally syndicated radio and television news programs. Spencer holds an MA in International Affairs from the George Washington University. Thank you, Glenn, and welcome.
Great, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you. As we were talking a little bit ahead of this meeting, I think we all agreed that Ron and I and Rick, who will be on here later, would love to be out there in person with you at some point in time. It's a beautiful part of Arizona. And hopefully by next year, we'll be able to do that. So in my presentation, we're going to talk about some of the labor issues that have emerged during the COVID era. So we'll talk about changes to paid leave programs, to unemployment programs. We'll talk a little bit about some liability issues that Ron touched on. And I want to close with talking about an emerging issue that could be a really, really big deal next year, depending on election outcomes. So let's go ahead to the first slide. And here we'll talk about the paid leave issues in the coronavirus relief bills. So Ron mentioned the various phases, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 bills. So the phase 2 bill, which was known as the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, or FCRA, this included federal paid leave benefits. And that's the first time that the federal government has ever required businesses to provide paid leave. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the Family Medical Leave Act. That is only unpaid leave. That is not paid leave. Now, the paid leave under FCRA, though, applies only to employers with fewer than 500 workers. The reason for that was Congress assumed that businesses big enough to have more than 500 employees probably already provided their own paid leave. So the cap was set at 500. Now, for businesses with fewer than 50, you may be able to get an exemption from that paid leave mandate, but the reasons for those exemptions are very, very limited. Key point to notice is that the paid leave, both paid sick leave and family leave, that is in addition to any other leave that workers have available. So whether you as an employer provide paid leave, this FCRA paid leave doesn't substitute for that. You can't swap them off. If you have a local government that requires paid leave, again, that is in addition to the paid leave available under FCRA. So the sick leave under FCRA, that can be taken if a worker is sick with COVID, if they're instructed to quarantine because of COVID, or if they need to take care of a sick family member, or take care of a child whose school is closed, which is obviously going to start becoming a pretty big issue going into the fall when schools are not reopening in a lot of parts of the country. Now, it's also important to note that that leave is not available if someone can telework. So like us at the chamber, we're all working remotely. We are not eligible for paid FCRA sick leave because we can do our jobs remotely. The way that leave is paid out, it's paid at the employee's regular rate of pay with a maximum cap of $511 per day, up to 10 days. So they get 10 days of paid sick leave. If you're taking care of a family member, though, as opposed to yourself, it's only 2/3 the regular rate of pay. The paid family leave program, and it looks like a little bit got cut off at the bottom there, but the paid leave program for family leave is only available if you need to take care of a child whose school is closed. Not available for quarantines or anything else. It's only if you're taking care of a child whose school is closed. So that is up to 10 weeks of paid leave, and that's paid at 2/3 the regular rate of pay with a maximum of $200 per day. And again, this paid family leave, not available if somebody can telework. Now, there's been some questions around this of, well, my kid is home from school. Yes, I can telework, but I can't because I've got to take care of the child during the day. The Department of Labor has encouraged companies to be very, very flexible in how they're doing this paid leave. But keep in mind that it may be, you may be able to take that leave incrementally. So maybe you start at 9 a.m. getting your kid logged on, whatever they need to do remotely. Noon, you're back at your job from noon to 4. Maybe at 4, you help your child a little bit more, and then you adjust your schedule that way. So that's how the department is looking at the paid family leave question. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, a couple more notes on the paid leave programs under FCRA. Both of these are funded by reimbursable tax credits for any paid leave that gets taken. Obviously, employers some employers don't have money to just start paying out paid leave benefits that they hadn't accounted for, especially during the midst of an economic downturn. So the way that these are funded is through those tax credits. So an employer who has workers taking paid leave can either file quarterly when you would send in your normal tax payments and request the refund to cover those payments at that time, or you can apply for advance payment from the Department of Treasury. And there's a form that you would fill out to do that, available right on the Department of Treasury's website. Both of these paid leave programs, the paid sick and the paid family leave, they expire at the end of 2020 under FCRA. Now, the House Democrats passed the HEROES Act. That is their phase 4 bill, as Ron mentioned. This would extend those paid family leave programs into next year. And it would also remove the 500 employee cap. So these paid leave benefits would be available to every worker at every company, from 1 employee up to however many thousands you might have. That is stalled because, as Ron talked about, the phase 4 negotiations are not going anywhere at the moment. So we don't know how this issue is ultimately going to be resolved. I think Republicans are of the mindset that they are not going to expand those beyond 500 employees, and they do not have an interest in pushing them into next year either, but this is all subject to negotiation. So we'll have to see how that plays out. If you as an employer have questions about how these programs operate, how specific to your workplace, the Department of Labor's Wage Hour Division has posted somewhere around 90 Q&As. They're very well written. They're very detailed. They will probably answer a lot of the questions that you might have about these paid leave programs. Now, there has been a court case filed in the New York State District of Federal Courts litigating some of the ways the department interpreted these statutes. So what do the guidance documents say about it? That's what the litigation was about. In particular, how it applied to healthcare workers. The statute had a simply worded exemption from paid leave for healthcare workers, but didn't define what that was. The Department of Labor defined that extremely broadly to cover nursing homes, outpatient facilities, EMT. I mean, pretty much anyone who's got a remote connection to healthcare. That was struck down by the court in New York. They didn't clarify how they wanted it rewritten. But the opinion seems to be that this decision only applies in that district. So Arizona, not part of that court district. So I think you still have the broad exemption under existing DOL guidance. But there are some questions for employers because of that litigation. So again, we're going to have to see how the department reacts to that. We can go on to the next slide. Okay, unemployment insurance. Obviously, there were a few questions that came up already about this issue. So the CARES Act, this was the phase 3 bill, made a lot of changes to the UI system. One of the biggest was that it extended unemployment insurance to self-employed workers for the first time ever. This is under the so-called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA. So this program allows people like independent contractors, gig workers, people who run their own businesses. I know there was a question about that. If you're considered self-employed because you're running your own business, you should also be able to apply for pandemic unemployment assistance. This program essentially operates just like your existing state benefits program. So whatever you would have gotten as a state benefit if you were employed by a formal employer, that's how your payments ought to be translated under the PUA program. So you apply for these benefits with your state agency, just like you would for any other regular unemployment insurance, even though the program is 100% federally funded. This program expires at the end of the year. We'll kind of see how Congress decides to deal with that as part of the Phase 4 negotiations. The CARES Act also created what's called the Pandemic Extended Unemployment Compensation Program. This provides an additional 13 weeks of federally funded UI benefits for any worker who has already exhausted their traditional benefits. And then finally, the CARES Act created the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation Program, known as FPUC. This is the additional $600 per week that Ron mentioned in his remarks. This program expired on July 31st, and it was not renewed. Now, we heard a lot of complaints from employers about this $600 top-up. Pretty much any company I've talked to in the last 4 months all said that yes, this was making it more difficult for them to either hire new workers, and there are companies who are hiring. It also was making it difficult for companies to bring back their existing workforce. And it really put companies in a bit of a bind, because you would ask somebody to come back from furlough, they would say they didn't want to come back. And some people were being very blunt, like they didn't want to come back because they were getting the $600 per week. And so technically, if you refuse work, you're no longer eligible for UI, but employers didn't want to be in the position of essentially ratting out their employees to the state workforce agency to get UI benefits cut off. So it was really becoming a difficulty for employers. Again, that program expired on July 31. Now, Ron talked about the deadlines and Congress sort of acting more quickly or more efficiently when they've got targets that they need to hit when things are expiring, but they didn't get to this one. So essentially, UI benefits went right back to where they would have been without any top up, which is roughly 45% of income replacement. Now, that's a little bit of a problem right now. And we think that there is a sound public policy reason to provide an additional benefit. Number one, we are in the middle of a pandemic. And if you've got workers who are feeling sick, have a family member who's been exposed, you don't want those individuals running back to the workplace because they suddenly have dropped down to 45% of income replacement on UI. It would be better if they continue to stay at home and not infect other people. So we do think that it helps to top up benefits a little bit. Plus, we have to be honest, there are some jobs that are probably not coming back. There are some restaurants that may not reopen. There are other entities like that may not reopen again. So those workers are going to need some additional time to either retrain, find new positions, whatever it is. This downturn's a little different from other ones we've been through, and it will take workers some additional time. So we think it makes sense, again, to provide some kind of top up. So we put forward some of our own thoughts on that. But the president himself decided to sign an executive order a week or so ago, creating what they call the Lost Wages Assistance Program. Unlike UI benefits, this is actually paid from FEMA. The money does not come from the Department of Labor. It's actually from a FEMA disaster relief fund. And this provides an additional $300 per week in federal benefits for people who are collecting UI. Based on the size of that fund within FEMA, it's about $40 billion. Those payments probably run out within 5 to 6 weeks. This is not a long-term solution. This is not a permanent solution. This is an opportunity to give Congress a little bit more time to come back and take care of what needs to be taken care of and deal with this issue. Right now, somewhere around 30, actually I think as of this morning, it was up to 40 states had applied for these LWA payments. There's only 2 that are actually paying those out right now. One of them happens to be Arizona. So good for you and for your state workforce agency that they have figured out how to do the technical changes they needed to do to their system to make those payments. Other states are going to start coming online soon. Now, while it's good news that other states will be coming online, the bad news is the more come on, the sooner that fund is going to run out of money. Again, this is not a permanent solution to this problem. Congress is going to have to come back and take care of this in a Phase 4 bill. We can go on to the next slide. All right, liability reform. Ron already touched on this, so I don't need to spend too much more time on it, other than to suggest that this is a really, really important issue for businesses to figure out. It's definitely a concern amongst almost every employer I talk to that they reopen their business, customers come in, maybe they get sick later, and then they file a lawsuit saying that's where they got it. This issue is compounded, in my view, by what a number of states have done. Fortunately, not Arizona, but a number of states have passed either through legislation or executive orders, some very broad-reaching presumption bills with regard to workers' comp. So what those laws say is, based on what kind of business you've got, there's a presumption that if one of your employees gets COVID, they caught it at the workplace. Now, I know what those states are trying to do. They're trying to make sure that there's a guaranteed income stream for someone who has to stop working because they've got COVID. But what they've effectively said is, in this business, there's a presumption that someone who gets sick got sick at the workplace. And you can bet that that will be exhibit A in any litigation that gets brought against a firm or a business like that, when the lawyer comes in and says, yep, the state has said this is a dangerous place to work. And it's a dangerous place because you can catch COVID here. My client caught COVID here. Let the litigation commence. So this liability shield that Ron talked about, really, really important for businesses. And it's important to emphasize that this is not a get out of jail free card. Employers are still going to be subject to litigation if they are grossly negligent, just completely fail to do the right thing, pay no attention to CDC guidelines or state health agency guidelines, and it's temporary. This is not a permanent relief either for employers. So important to note those points as you hear that debate. Now, the liability reform bill that's been introduced also includes relief from federal enforcement of a number of labor and employment statutes, so long as that's related to COVID. So OSHA couldn't come after you for somebody who got sick as long as you were following OSHA guidelines. Wage Hour Division wouldn't come after you for COVID-related issues as long as you're following the guidance they put out. So that's very helpful for employers too, but keep in mind that doesn't relieve you from any state agency enforcement on that side. So we'll see where this goes. As Ron talked about, this is Senate Republicans. I think it's their top priority. So this would certainly be part of any negotiations. We go ahead to the next slide. All right, just some return to work issues for people to think about. There's a lot of them. We don't necessarily have clear answers on all of these, but these are things that employers all around the country are facing as they start to bring people back. And so these are more questions for you to think about as you go through that process than there are answers here. So number one thing is employee testing. Some employers are providing tests at the work site. They are testing people before they come into work. Others are not. They're leaving that to outside parties. Others aren't testing at all. They're essentially requiring employees to do a self-attestation that they're not suffering from any symptoms or haven't been exposed to someone with COVID. There's no right answer here. I put this in just as something to think about how you as an individual business want to handle this question. And again, different people are doing it different ways. The key point is if you do have an employee who tests positive or someone who on their self-attestation says that they have symptoms, key thing is to isolate that individual and get them away from the workplace. PPE, another thing employers are wrestling with. How do they provide PPE? Do they require employees to use it in different circumstances around the office? Just to give you an example of how the U.S. Chamber is going to handle this when we go back in. If you're in a public area, masks will be required. Anyone who comes into the building is going to be required to adhere to those guidelines as well. A lot of states now have mask mandates. So for a business, if you want customers to come in, you may need to think about providing masks to customers who show up without them. But the key thing is just to know what your state requirements are and how you are going to deal with those issues, particularly things like if you've got an employee who refuses to comply, what are you going to do with that individual? One other thing to keep in mind here is states that have mask mandates are putting in place exemptions for certain health conditions. There are ADA considerations here. If you've got someone who is asthmatic, claustrophobic, whatever the issue may be, there may be occasional exemptions that you would have to allow with regard to masks. Another question employers are looking at is what to do with people in that vulnerable population of individuals who don't want to show up. Is that because they've got an existing health condition? Is it because they've got someone they're taking care of at home who is in a very, very high risk group? and they don't think it's safe for them to come back into the workplace for that reason. These are questions you're going to have to deal with and figure out how to handle when that does come about. For people who can work from home, pretty easy. But even there's some complications too. Someone may feel that by not being in the office, they are not being able to take part in certain projects, certain types of work that may inhibit their evaluations at the end of the year, their potential for raises or promotions. So that starts to become an ADA question of having to figure out how to make some accommodation for those individuals. Mass transit is a big issue for a lot of companies, bigger companies probably that provide subsidies. You know, in the age of COVID, do you want to be encouraging your employees to get onto mass transit? That's just another thing to think about. Elevators, obvious cause for concern. It's pretty hard to socially distance in a small elevator. The number of employees that could fit into an elevator at the chamber typically is 1 if you're maintaining a 6-foot distance. So that's an area to think about. And then a really huge issue, and Ron touched on this a little bit, is childcare. You know, if you've got employees who are reliant on childcare during the workday and that childcare just isn't available, you're going to need to figure out some way to accommodate those individuals. And this will be a real concern, A, because schools aren't opening up, but also B, because there may not be as many childcare slots as there have been in the past. These are low margin businesses as it is. And if they're being told they can only take in a third or so of the students they used to have before, that's going to really impact their revenue. That may impact their ability to remain open. So this childcare issue is a really, really big one that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. We go to the next slide, and this will be my last one. I want to take the opportunity to just float this issue and give you a quick overview of it, because we've got an election coming up in a few months. Don't know how that's going to turn out, but if it turns out in a particular direction, this issue is going to come roaring to life, and it will be a big one. So the bill is called the PRO Act. It actually already passed the House of Representatives this year. It would represent the most consequential change to labor law probably in 70 or 80 years. And if the Senate filibuster were to go away after November, which is certainly a possibility, this thing could actually become law pretty early in 2021. Like I said, it already has passed the House and would certainly pass the House again next year. So what is in the PRO Act? This is essentially a union labor law reform bill. Includes a couple provisions. I'll just run through them quickly, and then if anyone has questions, happy to answer. It includes card check organizing. So typically when a union organizes a work site now, they do it through a secret ballot election. This would effectively get rid of that and replace it with organizing simply by signature cards. So union reps would go around, they'd get workers to sign a card in public. And as soon as they got a majority of workers to sign those cards, they're in. There's no need for an election at that point. Once you get a union under that system in this bill, there would be mandatory arbitration of first contract. So first contract between a union and employer can be a drawn out process because you're doing it for the first time. You're negotiating a lot of terms and conditions of employment that you may not have to have thought about. Well, under this bill, if that process starts to take too long, the government essentially takes over the process, determines what the contract ought to look like, and just hands it down to you. And that's what you're going to be stuck with. So very, very concerning provision there. Arizona being a right to work state, under this bill, that would go away. This bill would abolish all right to work laws around the country. Independent contracting, a lot of companies are using independent contractors. The gig economy obviously is continuing to grow. We've all seen companies like Uber and Lyft and grocery delivery companies now. This bill would essentially convert almost all independent contractors in the country to employee status. So all that flexibility, the convenience, that would all go away under this bill. Very big concern is that this bill would lift the prohibition on secondary boycotts and picketing. And what that means is, under current law, if you're a labor union, got a dispute with an employer, that's where it stays. You're dealing with that employer. If you're picketing, whatever else, it's with that employer. Under this bill, that prohibition goes away. You could picket anywhere. So let's say you've got a hospital. Well, the hospital deals with a bank. The hospital deals with supply companies. The hospital deals with laundry companies. The hospital deals with all kinds of different entities, any one of which could now be subject to boycotts and pickets. So the way the unions look at this, it would potentially give them strangleholds over huge chunks of the economy because they could go after anybody. And then finally in this bill, there's a expanded joint employer standard. So if you think of franchises, what this bill would do is essentially make all the people who work at an individual franchise the employee of the larger company that runs the national operations. So that would be a big problem for the franchise industry in particular, but for a lot of other companies too. So again, this bill, not going to become law today, but depending on how the election turns out, this issue could be back in a really big way in 2021. Important point to note here, this bill got 40 co-sponsors in the US Senate. One of those individuals was not Senator Sinema. So Senator Sinema did not co-sponsor this bill. She's indicated to us she does not particularly like it. That's a really, really important thing. And it's something that if you have conversations with her or her staff to bring up, to thank her for not supporting this particular bill, because it would be a really, really bad bill for the country and for employers and for workers too, frankly. So with that, I'll stop. And I see Rick has joined us, my colleague from the U.S. Chamber. So if there's any questions, I'll get to those and then turn it back over to you to have Rick give his presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Glenn. We've got a lot of questions, so we're going to go through these pretty quick. Is there relief for small business owners who are not getting paid at work but are not eligible for unemployment because they are working?
Yeah, I think the pandemic unemployment assistance program should cover that eventuality. If you're a small business owner who's not getting income from that small business because of COVID and those kinds of issues, you should be eligible for pandemic UA. And again, the way you would get that is through your state unemployment office, the same place anyone else would apply for UI benefits. That's where you would go to do that. Now, because Arizona is one of only 2 states that has got the Lost Wages Assistance Program, their UI agency seems to be, your UI agency seems to be working pretty well. So the process for getting PUA hopefully wouldn't be as challenging as it's been in some other states. And if you are eligible for pandemic unemployment assistance, not only would you get UI through the state agency, you would also be eligible for that lost wages top up as well.
All right, let's one more question because I don't want to cut Rick short because he's really got some great information as well. How many jobs do you think would be lost if we were forced to make our independent contractors employees? It's a great question.
Yeah, it's really tough to put an estimate on there, but it would be a lot. So just for example, in California, where they've got a terrible bill called AB5 that you may have heard about, that bill attempts to make every independent contractor, almost all independent contractors, employees. And so Uber, I think, has said that they would be forced to get rid of somewhere around 70% of their drivers. Don't quote me on that because I'm not sure what the exact number is, but it's a lot. So all those types of companies that would have to convert people to employee status, they're just simply not going to keep as many people on. They couldn't. What they would have to do is they would have to determine, when do they have peak hours, where would they be able to schedule individuals? There will be a significant number of jobs lost were that to happen, but it's really hard to put an estimate on it. So.
Okay, we have a number of other questions and I want to make sure that we get to our next speaker. And I want to make sure if we don't get to your questions, if we can get these to you, Glenn and Ron and Rick, and maybe you guys can answer them, that we can actually push out to everybody who's on the call, because I really appreciate their time and your time. And I know we've got a couple of questions about, what specifically is the U.S. Chamber lobbying for and how are they helping and so forth, which I think is a much bigger. So let's go ahead. Elin, I'm going to turn it quickly back over to you. We'll let Rick do his presentation and then hopefully then we can get some more of those questions answered. So.
Will do. Thank you for joining us, Rick. Our final speaker is Rick C. Wade. He's Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Outreach at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Wade develops and implements programs and initiatives to help the Chamber create new business relationships and partnerships across diverse audiences. He also provides counsel on policy issues and leads special projects. Wade's wealth of knowledge and experience in both the public and private sectors enable him to give a megaphone to the voice of business across the country and share the positive impacts of the free enterprise system. Before joining the Chamber, Wade was principal of the Wade Group, a strategic communications and global business development firm, and was a partner at Harv's Investment Group, a consultancy that facilitated foreign direct investment into the US. Previously, Wade was a senior advisor and deputy chief of staff for former Secretary of Commerce Gary Lucke, where he was a liaison to the White House, businesses, trade associations, civic organizations, and local governments. He was a member of the White House Task Force on Puerto Rico, small business contracting, automobile recovery, military families, and historically Black colleges and universities. He also served on the Interagency Business Council and former Vice President Joe Biden's task force on the Middle Class America, and worked with the White House on implementing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Wade also worked with Commerce's Economic Development Administration to foster regional economic development in distressed areas, the National Telecommunications and the Information Administration, and expanding broadband to rural and urban America, the Minority Business Development Agency to create jobs through the growth of minority-owned businesses, and the Census Bureau on executing the 2010 decennial census. In addition, Wade was instrumental in expanding opportunities for US companies to sell their products in the global market. He represented the US at international trade forums, including the US-China Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, the African Growth and Opportunity Act Forum, and the Conference on the Caribbean and Central America. He served as special envoy to the Caribbean, oversaw private sector initiatives in Haiti following the 2010 devastating earthquake, and led trade missions around the world. He was a senior advisor to the 2008 Obama for America campaign and is a member of the Democratic National Committee. He was an executive at Hoffman LaRoche and Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. He also had experience at the South Carolina House of Representatives, the Cabinet of the Governor, and the Office of the President at the University of South Carolina. Wade received his BS from the University of South Carolina and an MPA from Harvard University. He was awarded honorary doctorates from Benedict College and South Carolina State University, and has received numerous awards for exemplary leadership and public service. Welcome, Mr. Wade.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Helen. That is exactly why I have no hair now. As I was listening to your introduction, but I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And happy that my colleague Glenn Spencer had a chance to present earlier. I'll be brief. Love to have some dialogue on this very important work that we're leading at the U.S. Chamber around equality of opportunity. All of us have witnessed firsthand what has been transpiring in our country and what continues to transpire today, particularly with regards to racial injustice and racial inequalities and so forth. This is my third year at the U.S. Chamber, and we actually had begun to create strategies and approaches to deal with a lot of the racial inequalities across business and industry, as well as diversity and inclusion over the last few years. And I just want to make a couple of mentions as we think about diversity and equity and inclusion across not just society, but business and industry. We typically think about that from the perspective of workforce, how many Black employees and how many Latinx employees and how many LGBTQ employees. And that's extremely important. And we're looking at that in more an expanded way as well. How do we create opportunities for more women and Black-owned and Hispanic-owned businesses across corporate supply chains to the extent that we can accomplish that and help minority businesses grow and expand? It adds value to our economy and our abilities to create jobs. We started about 3 years ago at the U.S. Chamber a program called the Next Gen Business Partnership, working with historically Black colleges and other minority serving institutions to make investments early on in young, bright minds and creating internships, not just the chamber, but in other trade associations, and hopefully state and local chambers. A great repository of talent that if we invest in them now can become a pipeline for our workforce of the future. And so as a result of what obviously has been transpiring more recently across America, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce it has decided to lean in and do even more to address what we call equality of opportunity. I don't think any of us can deny, and we certainly understand, that a lot of the inequities and injustices that we see today have been systemic across America's history. And if we are to solve them, we believe that the business community can play a very, very critical role in doing so. We watch how companies across America have joined together, have pledged support to address systemic racism and inequalities in America. And we've now stepped up in a big way to help be that collective voice around equality of opportunity. Next slide. So we launched this initiative, and I think our President Suzanne Clark, and I won't read the statement, but I think she captures it very well, that these are conversations, necessary conversations that we must take in America about systemic racism. And it begins also of listening and learning thoughtfully and leading and providing solutions to help ensure Black Americans and people of color have great opportunities to succeed in the American enterprise system, and thereby, therefore, across America and our society, be more inclusive and impactful. Next slide. So we thought we'd first listen and learn, which is extremely important as we deal with these types of issues. And we did that both at the national and local level. We convened more than 500 state and local chambers of commerce and business organizations and corporate leaders and trade associations stepped up formally to create this exciting new equality of opportunity initiative. The steering committee that was comprised of names you'd recognize, like Glenn Hamer, President and CEO of Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Carlos Phillips, President of Greenville, South Carolina Chamber. This was very, very strategic that we included in this strategy, this effort, state and local chambers, because you are at that local level where the work is done and where it is most impactful. Our partners also included all of the diverse chambers, such as the Black chambers and the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Asian Pacific Islander Chamber of Commerce, et cetera. This is perhaps probably the most impactful collective voice I've ever seen in my lifetime work in dealing with and addressing these systemic inequalities that exist in America. A unique collective voice of the business community leaning in to provide prescriptive changes and solutions. Next slide. And so we convened our first national conversation. Some of you may have participated on June 25th. We hosted what we call the National Summit on Equality of Opportunity Town Hall. It was an exciting event. Tom Donahue, the CEO of the chamber, led it off. My good friend Gail King joined us and did a fireside conversation with Suzanne Clark, as well as Randall Stevenson, the president, chairman of AT&T, Dr. Wayne Frederick, president of Howard University, one of the top HBCUs in America, who is now a member of our board and helping us guide our pathway across higher education as related to inequality, and a number of other people, including Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, not for his celebrity and his athleticism and history, but this is a former NBA legend who is investing heavily and been working for years around STEM education. How do we get more minority students involved and excited about STEM? Next slide. One of the things one of the ways we built this initiative, that we were determined to make sure that it was steeped in data and research. And our team has done an extensive amount of research to build this sort of robust and exhaustive research platform that powers our recommendations, which I'll talk to in a moment. And all of this data, and I hope you will draw from it as you think about how you can address these issues at a state and local level, but they can be found on our website at uschamber.com under the Equality of Opportunity Initiative. But some of these findings are stark, and you may be aware of, for example, that Black students are twice as likely to attend high poverty schools than their white peers. Black Americans represent 12% of the American workforce, but only 9% of workers in high earning management and professional positions. Represent 27% of arrests and 40% of the incarcerated population. Black Americans are 12% of the labor force, but only 9.4% of business owners. Next slide. So our agenda, as we looked at data, we decided to focus on 4 different areas: education, employment, entrepreneurship, and criminal justice. And we're also looking to add 2 more pillars of work around health as well as wealth, understanding their stark disparities there. And certainly in the health area, COVID-19 has exposed some of the systemic health concerns and inequalities that affect people of color. Next slide. And so as we convened and we listened to business leaders and stakeholders such as yourselves across the country and policymakers, what we've come up with an agenda that seeks to provide prescriptive solutions to these 4 areas. I won't go through all of them. Again, they can be found on our website. But for example, under our educational solutions, how do we advance more equitable educational funding, including student-based approaches, expand K through 12 school choice options, earn and learn and credentialing programs, and also, thinking about how do we close the digital education divide, which again has been exposed tremendously as a result of the pandemic, where there's a whole digital divide in terms of broadband on the one end, or also the ability for people of color in some communities even to have basic laptops to be able to engage in learning in this new world that we're living in. Next slide. Under employment, thinking through how we can promote more diversity in corporate leadership. And that's not just at the frontline employee level, but we're working horizontally and vertically, whether it's on corporate board diversity or C-suite. What are the best practices that we can advance across America for business and industry to engage in to create more diversity? Thinking about opportunity zones, a very good program, and how can we make those more impactful to drive investment in these communities where there has been a lack of economic upward mobility. Expanding talent pipeline management to underserved communities, improving minority networks through internships and apprenticeships. So there's a myriad of solutions that we collectively came up with that we'll be advancing through policy and business approaches. Next slide. And in the area of entrepreneurship, one of the lessons or experiences I've had in working with a number of historically Black colleges and minority serving institutions, that we do a great job of preparing our young people for the workforce, but we don't do enough to help them understand and to inspire entrepreneurship. So we're leaning in on that particular front. And also for established businesses, how do we increase opportunities for them to access corporate supply chains? Supporting the efforts of the Minority Business Development Agency, the only agency in federal government, which is an agency of the Department of Commerce that specifically focuses on minority businesses, but is quite frankly underfunded, and it's not even codified. It's by executive order. So we're supporting legislation to strengthen the Minority Business Development Agency. And a number of initiatives, most important, oftentimes the challenge is about access to capital. And so we're working with financial institutions. How can we convene private equity and venture capital lists to think about how can we unleash the flow of capital to minority companies across America? I will tell you that during our engaging with members of Congress around the CARES Act and PPP funding, for example, we also recognize that a lot of minority firms are unbanked or underbanked. And so we're working with some financial institutions to come up with strategies to be able to get the technical assistance and knowledge and help increase infrastructure that these companies have to be able to compete for lending as well as for private equity and other investment. And the next slide. And criminal justice is another area that we're focusing on front and center. A number of initiatives and policies that we're embracing and advancing. around improving educational opportunities for the incarcerated, fair chance hiring, as well as second chance hiring, as these formerly incarcerated individuals enter back into our society. How do we make sure that they have the skills and not barriers to entry into our workforce, including as well restoring voting rights for those who have paid their debt to our society. And then the final couple slides. And so what's next? We have already begun our work. We started with conversations, we listened, we learned. I'm excited to say that we've already endorsed some 13 bills in Congress of bipartisan legislation that would address a number of the issues that I just described. And we're moving forward to do more. One of the unique aspects of this Equality of Opportunity Initiative is that the work obviously can't just stop at the congressional level. Our expectation and hope with our member chambers through our Federation of State and Local Chambers that this work also will cascade down to state legislatures and city halls. And I'm excited that a number of chambers and groups such as yours are having this conversation, because it's very important that we address these issues from the federal, state, as well as the local levels. Next slide. So there's more to come on the state policy recommendations. And then the other big piece, which Neil Bradley, who is our chief policy officer and executive vice president, he's helping to lead a lot of policy work. And then I'm leading a lot of the private sector solutions, programs, and best practices. Independent of policy, there's so much that the business community has already been doing and can continue to do. And so we're sort of looking at this as sort of two pillars, the policy and then the best practice and approaches of the private sector. So look forward to future summits and events. We're here for you as a resource for data and best practices. We're actually creating sort of a town hall in a kit toolbox that we can deploy to our state and local chambers and our federation and other business associations to continue this very, very important work. And then I think the final slide. So it's about getting involved. I mean, I think this work requires a whole of society, from the private sector, public sector, the faith community, community organizations, and as individuals working together and turning this dialogue into real action and reclaiming and reaffirming for all Americans the promise of equal opportunity and equality of opportunity for every man, woman, boy, and child. So thank you for this opportunity, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions, comments, or that you may have.
Great. I know. Thank you so much. That was really informative, and it's great to see it, because it is a bigger issue than just Chandler and nationwide. And how can we incorporate these initiatives right into our everyday businesses? So I know that we have run over on time, and I apologize, but this information is too valuable. So if you don't have any other questions for Rick, I actually have put our the Chandler Chamber's information on our diversity and inclusion initiative, which we actually started about 4 years ago due to a member survey that we put out. And we have some amazing talent that is leading that initiative and continue to have those tough conversations, especially here in our own communities. So I want to applaud you for those efforts. So, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And I know we've run over on time. I appreciate it. I want to thank Elin and SRP again for your support of these types of programs and getting this information out. So all of your questions, if we have not gotten to them, I will get those to Glenn and Rick and Ron, and we will get you some written responses, and then as well as their PowerPoints for following today's presentation. Again, thank you again for joining us. This is a part of the Chandler Chamber Public Policy Series, and policy is really important here. So keep your voices heard and keep tuning in. So thank you again for amazing presentation.
Thank you.